So apparently there's this really awesome new Batman racing game in the arcade that I've yet to play, but I did play my fair share of the 1990 release published by Atari. This game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up based on the 1989 Batman movie. The goal of the game is to take out Joker's goons and stop him from taking over the city. The game has a bit of platforming in it. You'll jump to and from different areas as you progress through the stages. There's also numerous power-ups like batarangs that you can throw at your enemies, and you're going to need them after the first level. It also features a few driving levels in which you're placed into the cockpit of the Batmobile and the Batwing. Now, the driving portion of these levels is not actually controlled by the player, but instead is on a set path with you controlling a cursor on screen to take out enemies. The game also features small voice clips from the film, as well as a soundtrack based on that heard in the movie. This game was way above anything the NES could do visually, and even better looking than the Genesis could handle. It's a tough game, but well worth a few quarters.
Wait till they get a load of me.
There were a lot of racing games based on the city of San Francisco in the 90s. This is probably one of the first. 1990 saw the arcade release of Cisco Heat. The premise is a bit strange. You choose from one of two police cars as you race through the streets of San Francisco against other police officers. For a two-dimensional game, it's got some pretty nice scrolling effects that give the effect of some 3D elements. You'll travel along the Golden Gate, experience the ups and downs of the Bay Area hills, and even make your way down Lombard Street, if you can manage to steer your vehicle. There's only two speeds, a low and high gear, and the vehicles don't respond very well when it comes to handling, but regardless, there's just something I really enjoy about this game. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is a pretty infamous Genesis title, but a lot of people don't know there's an arcade version. Released a few months before the Genesis version, the arcade version is a very different game, despite both being developed by Sega. This version is less of a platformer and more of a beat-em-up. You'll use magic in the form of projectiles to attack enemies. The game is played in this isometric view, which at times can be frustrating when trying to attack enemies, but it's not quite as bad as some other games with this same view. Along with taking out enemies set to some of Michael's greatest hits, you'll need to rescue kids throughout the levels, which will give you health pickups. There are a wide range of enemies in the game, everything from random street thugs to robots, and the levels are also pretty diverse. Instead of your average special attack normally seen in other beat-em-ups, you get a dance attack. This attack will choreograph all enemies on screen into this crazy dance number, which ultimately kills them. There's also a power-up that can be activated by rescuing Bubbles the chimpanzee, which transforms MJ into a laser-shooting robot. Who's bad? Chase HQ was a game that saw many console releases. Like, a lot.
Atari ST, Commodore 64,
Game Boy,
Game Boy Color,
Sega Master System,
Sega Genesis,
Super Nintendo,
TurboGrafx 16,
and more.
But this is where the game all started. Developed by Taito and released in 1988, Chase HQ is more than a racing game. It really is, though. This was a really cool concept for the time. There were a lot of racing titles in the arcade, but in Chase HQ, you're not trying to race your opponent. Instead, your objective is to ram your opponent until his vehicle can handle no more. And once your suspect is detained, you progress to the next stage. The handling isn't really difficult, but if you do end up hitting something, you're pretty much screwed. I mean, you have a certain amount of time to reach your opponent, and then another time limit to defeat your opponent, so time is crucial here. There's also a boost system in the game. You'll receive 3 turbos at the start of each race, and you're going to need them. I always rather liked the way this game looks. A lot of racing games during this time had very basic, boring stages. They usually all looked the same with a minor color palette swap. Here, the environments are all pretty diverse and quite detailed for a 1988 release. I own Chase HQ2 for the Genesis and Super Chase HQ for the SNES, but this is definitely my favorite version.
Okay, you're under arrest on suspicion of armed robbery and murder.
AB Cop is a game very similar to Chase HQ. Instead of a cop car, you pilot this hover bike. Actually, it's an air bike, hence the name AB Cop. Released by Sega in 1990, the game takes place in a futuristic setting. Your objective is to reach and defeat your opponent before the timer runs out. You do so by ramming the hell out of your opponent until his health meter is depleted. You can speed up and jump while driving, but you are limited to 8 jumps per stage unless you collect extra jumps via power-up pickups. For a two-dimensional game, it does a lot of things graphically that make it feel a bit more advanced than it actually is. The game has some very smooth scrolling effects, and I have to say it looks really good. Just like Chase HQ, the timer is your worst enemy. It takes a pretty much flawless run to actually reach your enemy. And the music is hit or miss. There were some levels where I felt the music sucked, and others where I wanted to keep playing the stage just to hear it again. AB Cop was a fun game back in the 90s, and it's still pretty damn entertaining to this day. Crime City is another Taito game released in 1989 and actually has tie-ins with the Chase HQ series. You take control of police officer Tony Gibson, who's actually the craze driver behind the wheel in Chase HQ. This time you wield weapons. You make your way through the mean streets, punching and shooting anybody or anything that moves. The graphics are a little bit on the plain side, but the level designs were a bit innovative for the time. Like here, jumping from car to car while zipping down the freeway at breakneck speeds. The music is pretty good, and I really like the gun sound effects. The game obviously isn't without its flaws. Okay. But in 1989, this was something I could get excited about when I saw it in arcade. Power Drift is a 1988 release by Sega. This game was actually pretty graphically impressive for the time. It had nice big sprites and this tilting motion when you turn that made things feel a little bit more realistic, but also made some people a bit nauseous. Sega took advantage of sprite scaling to make this game look and feel like a 3D racer, even though it contains no polygons. The arcade cabinet was pretty notorious in the arcades as well. As you drive up and down the hilled courses, your seat would raise and lower as well as shake like crazy. The goal is to choose a racer and place third or better to advance throughout the game's courses. This sounds like a pretty easy task, but this game can be a bit difficult. The tracks are really tight and turns come on really quickly. This was one of those games I always loved but was never the best at. The music in this game is just plain classic. Kind of reminds me of a cross between Outrun and Sonic the Hedgehog. While this game did get ported to quite a few consoles, it never hit the Sega Genesis, which really bummed me out as a kid. Japan saw releases for the Dreamcast and the Saturn, but unfortunately I never got my hands on either version.
You are one dead dude. Congratulations!
Now last, but definitely not least, is a game that I absolutely love. There's just something about this game. Outrunners hit arcades worldwide in 1992 and is the 4th game in the Outrun series. The first thing that always drew me back to Outrunners was the fact that you could select from multiple vehicles. This hadn't been done yet in an Outrun game and I felt was long overdue. Back is the ability to select different paths that branch off from the road you're traveling on. This game looks really just plain incredible for the time, and honestly, I can appreciate its visuals almost as much to this day. The backgrounds look realistic, the roads have an almost 3D effect to them, and everything is just very colorful and lighthearted. Looks like a very early cruising game. Actually, that's exactly what it feels like. That's probably why I took to the cruising series as much as I did. Psychologically, it probably reminded me of this game, and anyway, I'm drifting off here. The music is really good here, and one thing I can appreciate is the fact that the engine sound effects aren't overly screaming at every second like a lot of other racers from the time. It's very subtle. There was a port for the Genesis published by Data East, but that game was borderline terrible compared to this one. This is what 2D arcade racers are made of.